Welcome back again tonight, faithful followers of this series, a series in which we are ironing out the various issues that surround the topic of prophecy and the end times. The fancy word is eschatology. For those who are new to this series and maybe have joined us only recently, we are taking a more or less thematic approach to the subject as a line-by-line, chapter-by-chapter approach to the book of Revelation, such as one might find in a commentary, is more confusing than helpful because of the use of parallelism and chiasm in the structure of this book. It's better to unpick the book, really, one parallel strand at a time, which is more or less one theme or aspect at a time. Now, in our previous study, we were looking at the book of Zechariah, and we found that if we read much of Zechariah's text with a view that it's written in the style of Apocalypse, then we can discern there a telling of the story of the church in the last days, up until the day of judgment. Of course, it was using the language of Israel of its day, but there was this other Israel in mind. The Israel that is historically near at the beginning of the book of Zechariah slowly gives place to an Israel that is historically further away later in the book. That is, it starts with Israel and ends with the church. The other minor prophets, of which there are better than half a dozen, Amos, Micah, Zechariah, all those kinds of prophets, Zephaniah, they tend to tell the same story but from different vantage points and with different points of focus. Where Zechariah speaks of, for instance, nations surrounding Jerusalem and God becoming incensed by them and fighting back to defend the holy city, Joel, for his part, speaks of invaders as climbing the walls of the city and going into the houses, raping and killing women and children, as the demonic hordes lay siege against the church. Now, Joel doesn't speak of the church either, but it can be discerned that his description of a kind of fall of Jerusalem is actually the overrunning of the church in the last days. Other prophets speak of the quick work that God performs in the world in the very last days of history. That climactic period will be marked by both a supernatural and cosmic battle. Joel speaks of blood and fire and pillars of smoke. And there are plenty of physical signs that accompany what's going on in the supernatural. It's not going to be a time of quiet heavens, for even Jesus mentioned the disturbances in the heavens above, which would sort of be going in parallel with the disturbances on the earth below. As the spiritual battle reaches a crescendo on the earth, there is also a cosmic battle going on in the physical universe. We find in in several references in several prophets, a recurring statement that the sun and the moon will be darkened at the very end of the age. And of course, this speaks to things like also the hope of man being darkened as we reach the end. The cosmos itself will be involved in that final great fray. Now, we find from things like the book of Isaiah that even the earth will be moved from its orbit. He speaks of it in terms of a lamb that runs off and nobody can catch her. And we can figure out also, by the way the stars and things move around or fall to the horizon, that the axis of the earth becomes apparently unstable if we follow particularly Isaiah 24. In the sixth seal at Revelation 6, the stars of heaven are described as being cast down to the earth. And that seems to indicate a major displacement of the Earth's axis. And perhaps it's even this occurs itself because there's a near collision with another heavenly body, and that's the sort of thing that could perhaps pull the Earth off its axis. We're not talking here about a magnetic inversion, which could happen with the axis not really changing. We're talking here about the gravitational axis, the spin axis. And it takes quite a lot of force to push a spinning object away from the axis of its spin. If you've ever tried turning the axis of a bike wheel when it's spinning, you'll see what I mean by about quite a bit of force being required. But that there is going to be force sufficient to move the Earth's axis around, and that's going to be on purely magnetic and gravitational forces alone, and so something has to come quite close to the Earth to cause that to happen. At the same time, of course, the stars will be cast down to the Earth, but of course this is also symbolic of rulers of the Earth being cast down from their positions of power. At the end of the world, you see, God will reject these rulers, and the casting down of stars on the day of the Lord, in a sense, also symbolizes the fact that God is now rejecting all of the world's rulers and throwing them down from their positions of office. Positions of power and glory are sort of represented by places up in the stellar sky, and they are being removed from that sky. Now, each prophet fills in another sort of aspect of the picture, another piece of the puzzle, but all agree about one thing: the day of the Lord will come. Now, my wife had a dream not so long ago, I think it was 2017, of the moon or some similar heavenly body. And first it was dropping slowly and then faster and faster from heaven, and everybody was trying to run from their houses to who knows where. But as they ran, lava began to pour out everywhere, and people had nowhere to go. She woke up and she was crying, "No, no," and not just crying, but she was actually weeping from what she was experiencing in her dream. See, it's one thing to talk about what may happen in the last days, but it's quite another to be there to actually experience them. Now, among the details given to us in the New Testament, Jesus and Paul refer us back to events connected to the temple in Jerusalem. That's sort of the focal point which gives us some of the key signs at the end of the age. Jesus refers us specifically to the sign of the abomination of desolation, and he asks us to pay close and careful attention to the sign, probably in the first instance because this event is a marker in time in the chronology of the end time events. If Jesus was asked what sort of signs will there be of his coming, and he gives a whole lot of broad and general signs, but the only real specific sign he gives is this one. Now, in Hebrew, the expression is not exactly abomination of desolation as it sort of comes across in English from the Greek, but it's more like appalling abomination. But clearly it's something that desecrates the temple. With the appearance of the appalling abomination, according to the prophet Daniel, which is where Jesus gets it from, there remain but 1290 days of human history. This is slightly different from the 1260 we've been speaking of. There seems to be 30 extra days, and it may be that from the time that sort of 30 days after this appalling abomination starts up, when there are still 1260 days to go, that may be when the actual persecution and attempts on the life of Jews and Christians begins. So there's 1290 days of human history before Christ appears a second time in judgment. And that period is marked out by this appalling abomination, apparently in the temple in Jerusalem. Daniel's prophecy indeed refers to this abomination in 3 different chapters, although, like Zechariah, with both near and far fulfillments. So what I'm saying is that there is a fulfillment of the appalling abomination more or less in the days not so far after Daniel, but then there's references to another similar kind of abomination that occurs right out there toward the end of the world, toward the end of the world age. However, there's a second, more troubling significance of this event, and this stems from the fact that in the Jewish psychology, God plays his role as the great protector of the people and temple. The temple can only really be captured if God is highly displeased with the people. To allow its capture and subjugation by Gentiles, it is necessary for the protections of God to have been temporarily removed from the nation. and this would only really occur if God was in some way very displeased with the nation. The Apostle Paul also speaks in 2 Thessalonians 2 about such a removal of protections, which is to be followed by the appearance of the wicked one, that man of sin. And Paul says he will sit in the temple of God, announcing himself to be God. This indicates not just an assault on Judaism, but also now on Christianity. And this sin will mark the beginning of what Jesus has referred to, it could have been Paul referred to as perilous times, in the first act of bringing the world to its end. So, as it was in the time of Jesus when he, just after his resurrection, it's events revolving around the temple that are pointing us to the signs of the times. So events revolve around the temple here too, only now it's not the Messiah but a false Messiah that is linked to the sanctuary. So chronologically, this event is related to the casting out of the dragon from heaven in Revelation 12, which gives rise to the appearance of the two world-dominating beasts of Revelation 13. These events lie almost dead center in the apocalypse. Like the great 70 weeks of Daniel, in the abomination of desolation, we see symbolized the general spiritual rejection of the religion of Christ. And there is a global plan to extinguish the faith in favor of a new Luciferian world order. Given the primal place of religion in the old Roman and pagan world order, there was an enormous significance when an invader of another land replaced the gods in the local sanctuaries with a new set of gods. It's more than a tongue-in-cheek gesture. It represented a total rejection of that society, of its divinities and its ideals, and the total subjugation of its gods to the new gods. And in the same way, this future desecration of the great temple in Jerusalem will indicate the beginning of a campaign to eradicate the name and the worship of the biblical God Jehovah from the earth. If we are to accept the writings of Luciferians like Albert Pike, it may be that the one seating himself within the temple sanctuary and declaring himself to be God will also claim in some way to be Lucifer himself. Today we launch into part 1 of a two-part study in which we look at the historical and future desecrations of the Jerusalem temple. And we hope that the historical desecrations can inform us about the future desecrations. So, Session 9, Desecrators of the Temple, Part 1. The abomination of desolation is a pagan idol or its equivalent. And it desecrates the temple and renders all the ordinances within that temple to be defiled. That means it makes them illegitimate for rendering the service of removal of sins, and the sins of the people cannot be removed, and in this way the people are spiritually compromised. There have been at least 3 major historical desecrations of the Jerusalem temple. One involved a pagan idol or image in the temple area. One involved the presence of a false priesthood ministering in that temple. And one involved the mistreatment of Christ, who was in fact the Lord of the temple, but was cast out and killed by those who thought they were the masters. And all of these inform us about the spirit of the future desecration. The phrase abomination of desolation, at least in the case of Daniel 9:27b, is really more like, and put it in a rendering that I've made here, which is not necessarily exactly the same as a biblical one, but pretty close. And because of the protection of abominations, notice I've replaced the word overflow with protection. Because of the protection of abominations, there shall be a desolator, even until the consumption. And what is determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. And this is working from the Darby version, a favourite of the Brethren's. Now, there's a kind of double sense of desolating abomination in these references. And by the way, here we have a picture in the background which shows Cain and Abel. In the background, there's Cain, who's sort of jealous. He's got his vegetables, and Abel, who's praying and offering his offering to God with meat. And this is sort of how the world began. There's a true religion and a false religion, a true heart toward God and a false heart toward God. Anyway, that sort of lies sort of deep behind this whole thing of true religion, false religion, one trying to supplant the other. But the phrase abomination of desolation, to get back to my point, from Daniel 9:27b, introduces us to a kind of double sense in desolating abomination, because we learn from Daniel 9 that the desolator comes because there is some kind of abomination going on in Israel. And so God sends another sort of abomination to overthrow the first. So the abominations of the desolator are because of the abominations of the Israelites. The battleground is the temple. There's something at the heart of Judaism that is abominable to God, so he brings in a desecrator to discipline his people Israel and to make them take a good look at themselves. God's reaction is so severe, in fact, that it seems the Jews have truly insulted him. The insult appears to be the sacrificial system itself and its resurrection in a rebuilt temple. The Antichrist may indeed be allowed into Israel simply to overthrow this latest Jewish rejection of the new covenant and its attempt to resurrect the old. Like Cain presenting a tainted offering, God will turn his face away from it. The new temple will seem like the golden calf in God's eyes, which he despised. So let's look at each of the three references in Daniel, starting with Daniel 11. So we're sort of going backwards through the references in Daniel. In Daniel 11, we have a long discourse describing battles between a king of the north and a king of the south. Now, if we look in the map in the background, we sort of see that the king of the north coalition involves Syria, Iraq, and Iran, whereas the king of the south was a sort of coalition between Sudan, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. And we have this sort of running battle between the two regions. So the king of the north could be any sort of king from Syria, Iraq, or Iran. So there are many modern day suggestions as to who the king of the north might be, and they range from NATO to Russia to Iran and to Turkey. The king of the south could be either Arabia or Egypt, as far as most people are concerned. For now, we are ignoring American-based interpretations that Russia and the United States are meant, and that the battles are perhaps across the North Pole. Most Bible commentators, however, would find the interpretation of the Daniel 11 events in Middle Eastern history of the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, and they do not seek for a future interpretation of that passage. But others would pick off the verses from perhaps verses 36 onwards as suddenly being future-related, bouncing from the local to the futuristic. The identification of kings of the north and kings of the south, we're going to come back to that shortly. But the passage in Daniel 11 seems to be so historically accurate for events that happened in the sort of period between 250 to 160 BC that some theologians, and I include here theologians from the Otago University, are even sort of accepting the idea that that part of Daniel might have been actually written after the event and then reincorporated into the book of Daniel as if it had been a prophecy. So it was like a prophecy written after the event, which is a kind of forgery. And that's a pretty strong statement to make, but that arises from the fact that the events of history at that time were so accurately portrayed in the prophecy, which is quite a long prophecy with many details in Daniel 11. It's within that long prophecy that we have this reference here to, one of the references to the abomination of desolation. So Daniel 11:31 is sort of toward the end of this 40-verse chapter. I think it's 45 verses or so. So this is verse 31 in Daniel 11. We read, "Armed forces will arise from his midst, and will desecrate the fortified sanctuary, abolish the daily sacrifice, and establish the destructive desecration." So I'm using here the International Standard Version. This standard historical interpretation is also shared by Jewish commentators who agree that the irate king who sets up his camp in Jerusalem is Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who desecrated the temple at around about 168 BC. Antiochus IV was a Seleucid king, and Seleucia was an ancient territory also known in New Testament times as Cilicia, and now found partly in modern Turkey and partly in Syria. However, Cilicia was completely Hellenistic at the time, which means, fully saturated in Greek culture, and its culture was an extension of the Athenian culture. Antiochus IV had been ruling in Jerusalem for only a few years before he became frustrated with the slowness of the Jews to accept his Greek institutions. Like all Greeks, Alexander the Great onwards, they felt they were doing the world a favour by spreading their culture over the world. So at a certain point, he instituted rules to enforce the speaking of Greek in Israel. And he also began to push for the adoption of Greek institutions such as schools and law courts to teach ideas from the Greek culture and to make judicial decisions based on Greek laws. And he pushed for the worship and recognition of Greek idols such as Zeus. Now, of course, the second commandment of the Jews in the Ten Commandments is you should not have any idols. And so here he was putting a great idol at the center of worship in Israel, and of course the Jews were not going to accept it. And so he was trying to cause the people to recognize Greek gods alongside Jehovah. And it was under the Maccabean resistance that Israel finally gained its liberation from Antiochus IV, and a new priesthood developed under the Maccabean priest Mattathias, which continued to serve to the time of Herod the Great. Now, since the time of the high priest Ananias II at about 181 BC, the priesthood had been hijacked, and each new high priest had to be approved by the Syrian overlords, who generally sold the office to the highest bidder. The same system of accepting highest bids continued until the time of Antiochus IV. This appropriated control of the priesthood was also part of the desecration of the temple, because it was an insult to God to think that his religion could be sold to the highest bidder. Now we jump to Daniel 12, which sort of picks up on this theme. Now, of course, Daniel 12 is not separate from Daniel 11. It's actually a sort of follow-on and flow-on from that chapter. So the reference to an abomination in Daniel 12 is really a second reference to the abomination that's mentioned earlier on in Daniel 11. So Daniel 12:11, and from the time that the regular burnt offering, and this, by the way, is the angel interpreting the vision to Daniel, and from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, this shall be 1290 days, the English Standard Version. This appears to refer back to that prophecy at Daniel 11:31, except that the angel indicates that the desecration occurs now at the end of time. What he says in his words, he says the time of the end. Moreover, the desecration of Antiochus lasted for nearly exactly 3 years, about 7 months short of the 1290 days that the angel is now speaking of. So it appears there are 2 periods of desecration that are therefore referred to in the same passage. If we go back to Daniel 9 and the message of the 70 great weeks of years, there's a reference there too to an abomination of desolation. We've already seen it before, and perhaps we just haven't concentrated on it. But it says that, and this is the 70 weeks with the Messiah and all the rest of it, that he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the middle of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And for the overspreading of abominations he shall make it, that is the temple in Jerusalem, desolate, even until the consummation, and that which is determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So the very last reference to desolate is the desolator himself. And he is desolate and he desolates, and he is desolating because of the overspreading of abominations in Israel. So let's break it all down. What we find is that the abomination is the abomination of desolation, or maybe better stated perhaps as the abominable desolation, is set up in response to Jewish abominations. Desecration and desolation are sent as retribution for Israel's spiritual desolations, which is a hard thing to say when Israel has come back into its nationhood. We have a whole population of nice young people there living there who seem very reasonable, but they are basically secularists. There's very few people in Israel today who actually have any religious inclination, perhaps 5%. And of those, well, perhaps I'm being a bit harsh, perhaps 15% if we allow for those who are moderately religious. But the very religious, the Likud type people, the Hasidim, only constitute 1 to 2% of the population. And yet they're calling all the shots as far as things like whether the temple should be rebuilt, how it should be rebuilt, what sort of people should be the priests there, and all of those things. They truly want to go back to the old system that was there before Jesus died. And it's the works of people like them in the time of Jesus that has brought forth the retribution for Israel's spiritual desolations that still has to be visited on the land in this upcoming future. So God seeks retribution for Jewish mistreatment and rejection of Christ. Jesus also mentions days of vengeance. Now, it's not that they just rejected Jesus at the time that he was alive and then killed and the time the church was born, but in fact this rejection of Christianity, of the doctrine of Christ, and of all of those people who followed Christ actually continued pretty much right throughout the last 2,000 years. So there's nothing much changed with the Jewish people. They've had many years, many opportunities in a sense to turn and change and adopt the Christian faith. And perhaps it was unfortunate that the Catholic Church took over the faith and introduced lots of doctrines that were basically unacceptable to the Jew and made it very hard for the Jew to even embrace the faith without suffering serious reprimand, because the Catholic Church was very hard on any Christian even that rejected such doctrines as the Trinity. So if the Jews were going to convert to Christianity, they would have been expected on pain of death to also adopt the doctrine of the Trinity, which would have been an offense to them because they believe in only a singular deity and singular entity, and no such thing as a deity or even Father and Son living in eternity together, but just one single God. And so in many ways it's not entirely their fault, but they have always resisted the adoption of Christianity. And so at the end of the age, Jesus talks about days of vengeance. And this kind of traces right back to the time that he was rejected and killed by the Jewish leaders. So God will, in order to bring about these days of vengeance, he will have to reject the new Jewish temple economy that we are expecting to see arise within the next few years. So the desolate in this prophecy could just as easily be the Jews as the people of the Antichrist. And so it's a hard thing to say about Israel, but in one way the Antichrist comes in as a kind of spiritual embodiment of the Jewish nation, just as Christ before him was also the spiritual embodiment of this nation, of the nation in his death. See, Jesus took upon himself the nation's sins when he died to take away their sins, but because they rejected him, he said another would come and they would accept him, and that person will also be an embodiment of their spiritual state, but he would be a secularist, a rejecter of Jehovah, a rejecter of Jesus Christ, a rejecter of Christians. He will be an antichrist. Although many seem to think that the he in Daniel 9:27a, who causes the sacrifices to stop, is the future antichrist, and we've talked about this before, and as he desecrates the future Jerusalem temple. We've already shown from the chiastic structure of Daniel 9:24 to 27, and sorry to those who have missed this study before, that the he in that passage is actually the Messiah. Now his death becomes an eternal sacrifice and replaces the old sacrificial system. The old system has now become both obsolete and unnecessary. So in Daniel 9:27b, it is the Messiah who makes the temple and its sacrifices desolate because of the overspreading of abominations. Well, it's hard to imagine the Jews, for instance, putting idols and things like that in their temple and worshipping those. So the abominations that overspread in the temple of Jerusalem cannot be something pagan, but they must be something to do with the old Jewish religion. And this seems to indicate God's displeasure at the Jews for going back to animal sacrifices, given that Christ's sacrifice is enough already to set the old system aside. That is, the way in which he, the Messiah, puts an end to the Jewish abominations is to bring in a foreign desolator to desecrate the temple and its systems. So when the Jews think they're going to serve God by putting back the old system, Jesus will send in a desecrator to stop them doing that. In a way, both Christ and Antichrist are referred to in Daniel 9:27. They both, in their own way, put an end to the sacrifices. So let's just do a face value summary at the moment. Of the three mentions of the abomination of desolation, two are about the end of the age, and one is about a more immediate future in the time of the writer. Daniel 9:27 is about the end of the age. Daniel 11:31 is about Antiochus IV and his period of real pressure on the Jews. His great desecration was from 168 to 165 BC. And then there's the wicked king at the end of the age, and we see him described in Daniel 12:11, and this really picks up on the same references, Daniel 9:27, and he will desecrate the future temple for 1290 days. The description at the end of Daniel 11, after verse 36, tells us the most about the character of this final Antichrist and how he is to appear in Israel. Now let's see what we can glean about this future situation. First of all, Daniel 11:36 and 37 explains that he is something of a megalomaniac. The king will do as he pleases, exalting himself and claiming to be greater than every god, even blaspheming the God of gods. By that, we assume it means Jehovah. Paul, in 2 Thessalonians 2, attributes this to the final great man of sin. Paul says he sits in the temple claiming that he himself is God. The truth appears to be that this man is a consummate atheist, defying all gods as if they didn't exist, almost challenging them to prove their existence. Paul describes him sitting in the Jewish temple, even declaring himself to be God. Now there's a childishness about him that is reminiscent of the Roman emperors Nero or Caligula, a kind of childish mocking of that which is holy, but without really realizing what it is that they are mocking. He appears to be a person who also believes that the power he wields is rightfully his. He is not humble before any greater power. He will have no respect for the gods of his ancestors, nor for the god loved by women, which is probably Tammuz, nor for any other god, for he will boast that he is greater than them all. And that's quoting from Daniel 11:37. He appears to come from an ancient culture, therefore, that has worshipped many gods, and there is some relationship to the Roman god Tammuz, who is a figure also worshipped in Satanism. So there are suggestions that there could be Catholic or Masonic connections here. Yet he has, it seems, also rejected these gods of his ancestors or of his forefathers. And perhaps it's a kind of a form of mockery but he invokes instead his own new god, a god of fortresses. The Hebrew word is mahuzim, and supplicates this god with costly offerings. It says in the text at 11:38, instead of these he will worship the god of fortresses, a god his ancestors never knew, and lavish on him gold and silver and precious stones and expensive gifts. He conquers countries in part by placing them at a position of defeat, but rather than completely destroying them, he then promises their leaders continued power and wealth if they simply capitulate and join him. He then shares his loot with his victims, which just seems very sporting for a conqueror. So 11:39, it says, claiming this foreign god's help, he will attack the strongest fortresses. This is the god of fortresses that he solicits the help from. He will attack the strongest fortresses. He will honor those who submit to him, appointing them to positions of authority and dividing the land among them as their reward. Now in Daniel 12:11, we see the connection now to the sacrifices in Jerusalem. And here's a picture, as it were, of the proud horn that rises up amongst the 10 horns in Daniel 7's vision. This proud horn seems to be a picture of this end times Antichrist. Now, from the time that the regular burnt offering is taken away, that means the daily sacrifices, and the abomination that makes desolate is set up, there shall be 1290 days. So this is kind of the macrocosm, if you like, this sort of voice of effrontery toward God, this kind of disrespect toward the faith of the Jews and the Christians. And we will sort of see this in the microcosm, sort of intensified and distilled. But we would probably expect from the history of the church age, which involved the voices of the papacy and also of Islam, that these are the kinds of forces that will also appear in the very last days that immediately precede the second coming of Christ. Now, just jumping back to Daniel 11:31 to 32, this is sort of how he operates. Forces shall be mustered by him. So he leads a sort of conspiracy, a whole confederation, as it were, of armies, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. That means they have to enter Jerusalem, conquer Jerusalem, and then they'll defile the sanctuary fortress, which is in the temple. And then they should take away the daily sacrifices, which we therefore assume have been reinstituted, and place there the abomination of desolation. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. The he here is this proud ruler, this final Antichrist, and he shall actually corrupt people with flattery. He'll speak very nicely and in very high tones about certain people, but in so doing, he will bring down those who have been doing wickedly against the covenant of God. And the covenant being spoken of here may not be the old covenant, it may be the new covenant, and it may be that the Jews are doing wickedly against the new covenant. Now he will corrupt them with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. So we see that forces shall be mustered by him. So he leads this coalition of forces, a confederation, and the idea of a confederation does come up a few times in the Psalms and other places. And so this is not the only time it appears. There isn't going to be a single nation, but a group of nations that actually attacks Israel. The him that comes in is the invader, and he's undoubtedly an anti-Yahwist. He's against Jehovah. He's an anti-Semite. He's against the Jews, and he's a man of sin, according to Paul, a very sinful man, a very lawless man, a man that couldn't care less about people or God. And he shall place in the holy place of the temple the abomination of desolation. That's the abomination that desolates, or the appalling desolation, as we mentioned before, which is going to be probably some kind of sacrilegious object or statue or idol that is placed in the sanctuary where ordinarily the holy of the Ark of the Covenant would be, and where the glory of God ought to dwell. But of course, if God is displeased with his people, his glory also departs from the sanctuary, making it possible for a pagan idol to be moved into there without suffering retribution from God. Now, under Antiochus IV Epiphanes, historically, this desecrating object back in 168 BC turned out to be a large statue of the Greek god Zeus, which replaced the holy ordinances with worship of a pagan god and its pre-classical Greek ideals. Even the holy book, that is the Torah, was outlawed in Israel when this happened. Now, in the days of Caligula, which was pretty much in the days of the early church, another attempt was made to place a statue, this time of the Roman emperor himself, in the same temple. And after the temple's destruction, Hadrian also placed a statue of Zeus on the holy site, even though it was now ruined. But it was kind of a final insult to the Jews. So all of these people, Antiochus and Caligula and Hadrian, they all had the same spirit of wanting to desecrate the religion of Israel and the religion of Jehovah, seeing it somehow as being offensive to their own cultures and basically polytheistic practices. I mean, the emperors were amongst those who said they themselves were God, and this man who's coming will say the same. So there is something about this coming Antichrist which resembles the Roman emperors of the past, who also made statues of themselves and insisted that people worship those statues. And this was one of the reasons Christians at that time got into a lot of trouble, because many of them would not bow down to the statue of Caesar, claiming that it was in fact idolatry. Not only that, but they said that no man on earth could ever be treated as God. There was only one God. So it says, those who do wickedly against the land covenant, or perhaps the new covenant, are those who do not believe in a covenant between God and Israel, or perhaps even between God and the Gentiles. And so the one who comes will even turn around in retribution and in revenge and reject Israel's very right to the land, which was fundamental to the promise to Abraham. The man of sin will have some sort of charm. He will corrupt others with flattery. He praises the covenant despisers. He sort of encourages them all in what they're doing. And he draws their commitment to something more universal than the Jewish and Christian faith, to some sort of, in the time of Antiochus, it was to the universal Greek culture. In the modern day, perhaps to globalism, or perhaps to some other religion or culture that spans the world but considers itself better or a replacement to the Jewish religion. And we might possibly throw Islam into that category, because Islam also claims that the promises that the Bible says were given to Isaac were in fact originally given to Ishmael, and that the Jews changed the name from Ishmael to Isaac, and that the Jews actually stole the promise from Ishmael and from the Arabs, and that at the end of the time God will restore the rights back to the Arabs that were always theirs. And so it can be somebody like this. Now, Daniel 12:11, as we mentioned, speaks of 1290 days. Again, it says, from the time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1290 days. The 1290 days refers to the time from the setting up of the abomination. This strongly suggests that the Jewish sacrificial system will be in place again for this to occur. And while we don't see a temple or a sacrificial system in place yet, we know there are many preparations already underfoot. Priests have been retrained, temple artifacts have been rebuilt, animals have been found to start the sacrifices when there is a chance to go ahead. The only thing waiting to happen now, in fact, is the rebuilding of the temple. And the Jews are now very keen to find, to get a go-ahead to start that project. So let's just have a look at a video now which speaks about the rebuilding of the third temple. It's only short, 5 minutes or so, and we'll sort of see what they have to say.
For the building of the Third Temple.
On June 7, 1967, Israeli Brigade Commander Mothe Gur made an announcement the Jews had waited to hear for some 2,000 years. Retaking this ground was important for a number of reasons. For one, it's where King Solomon built the first Jewish temple. After the Babylonians destroyed it, Zerubbabel laid the foundation stone for a second temple that was later expanded by King Herod. It fell at the hands of the Romans in 70 AD. When Commander Gur declared that the Temple Mount was back in Jewish hands, it rekindled hope for a long-awaited Third Temple.
The Six-Day War was a miracle of biblical proportions, and was a cataclysmic opening of a new era for Israel and for the whole world.
Rabbi Chaim Richman of the Temple Institute is dedicated to rebuilding the Jewish temple. He sees the time since the Six-Day War as a prophetic shift.
It would be hard, I think, not to see what's happened in the past 50 years as a tremendous jumpstart, a tremendous fast forward. It's more than prophetic. It's like a kiss from heaven, you know, it's like a divine kiss. It's an intimate brush with the reality of God's compassion and love, and He keeps His promises.
The Institute shares a key connection to the battle for Jerusalem. Its founder, Rabbi Yisrael Ariel, served with the 55th Paratrooper Brigade that captured the Temple Mount. After the victory, a Jordanian guide gave them a remarkable tour.
His job was to carry the company machine gun. There's a very beautiful photograph of that. He actually, the first night of the liberation of Jerusalem, he was given the task of guarding over the spot of the Dome of the Rock, which of course we believe is the Holy of Holies. The story, though, that he told us is that the soldiers were on the Temple Mount, and it was just like the first hour or so. And they were approached by a Jordanian fellow in Western dress who explained that he was the official tour guide for the Jordanian parliament, and he offered to take the soldiers and show them the sights on the Temple Mount. And he takes the soldiers, you know, the rabbi there, and he says, well, this is exactly where the sanctuary stood. This is where the altar stood, and then this is where the menorah stood. It tells him all these things about the history of the Holy Temple. Finally, the rabbi asked him, why are you telling us all this? And he said, well, we have a tradition from our fathers, they from their fathers, that one day the Jews would wage a war and conquer this mountain and rebuild the Holy Temple. And I assume that you're starting tomorrow. I want this to be my part in helping you.
What was their reaction to that story?
Well, gosh, I guess they were pretty surprised, but the bottom line is, in hindsight, it doesn't look like we were ready.
50 years later, that's changed, with the Temple Institute preparing blueprints and gathering official temple elements, such as the priestly garments. Richmond is also dispelling myths about the temple on today's digital loudspeaker, YouTube.
Let's start at the beginning. What was the Holy Temple really all about?
All of this means talk of rebuilding the temple is no longer considered a fringe idea.
Today, there is a lobby in the Knesset of how many members of Knesset that are constantly speaking about Jewish rights to pray on the Temple Mount. There are members of Knesset that actually talk about the rebuilding of the Holy Temple. Do you understand that 20 years ago, these people wouldn't have been given a moment on prime time television in Israel to say these things? They would have been laughed out.
So, a few years ago, this was considered fringe?
Zealots, lunatics, peculiar. Today it's mainstream.
One of those members is Yehuda Glick.
10 years ago, there was not a single member of Knesset who ascended Temple Mount. Today, we have 20 of the Knesset members who are interested in ascending Temple Mount, praying on the Temple Mount, and are part in the battle for the redemption of the Temple Mount and for bringing the Temple Mount back into the center of the next step in the redemption process.
Richmond sees the temple through the eyes of the prophet Isaiah, who wrote 3,000 years ago that God's house would be a house of prayer for all nations.
It means basically that there's a God in the world and that the best is yet to come, and that we are so connected to Him and to each other and to that purpose and to all humanity. And it's just a wonderful privilege to be here with you today, to be looking out over Jerusalem and to realize that we're living in probably the most important time in history. If you believe in the God of Israel and you see His hand on His people and you understand the tremendous changes that have gone on over the years, you see that the one who brought us this far isn't finished and will keep His promises.
So we've seen something here about rebuilding the third temple. And we hear a lot of talk about Ezekiel's temple, which is described in Ezekiel chapters 40 to 48. There's a whole 9-chapter section there which describes this elaborate new edifice and its kind of newly instituted priesthood and all kinds of features of that temple that are kind of a improvement and perfection of the old system. Many call this the third temple and believe that it's a literal description of a literal temple in a literal millennium. And it certainly fits in as the temple of the Messianic age. In fact, many Jews and many Christians also believe that when Jesus returns, He will build this temple for the millennium. Other Jews believe this temple has to be rebuilt before Jesus can come back, or the Messiah can come back, in order to enter that temple at the beginning of the millennium. There are two views on this, but in either case, there's a sort of strong leaning toward a literal reading of those passages. However, it's my contention that the millennium will not turn up. There is no future literal millennium, and that the millennium is in fact the church age, and then therefore one should not expect a literal fulfillment of those passages in Ezekiel, but should instead understand that Ezekiel's temple is a description of a kind of perfect spiritual order that will exist in the church age, and therefore in the church it's just using sort of the imagery of the old temple and its ordinances as a springboard for this new and improved spiritual order. Anyway, because of its structural requirements, Ezekiel's temple couldn't in any case even have been built before the 20th century. In the last couple of decades, however, with the help of computer programs that can visualize and virtually, in the true sense, in the virtual world, construct the edifice, the whole plan for the temple has actually now been developed, and 3D representations have been produced. It can even be seen online in YouTube videos. One point to note is that the Ezekiel temple would not be able to fit on Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and I think most people don't realize that. It's really a very extended and large edifice. It's kind of attached to a kind of city in Ezekiel's vision. It's sort of at the center of a large area of land, and the only real place one could feasibly house that Ezekiel temple and that sort of small city that goes around it is somewhere out in the Judean wilderness. So let's have a look at a video that just talks about, it's only 7 minutes, it talks about Ezekiel's temple and about how now technically it could be possible to actually build it.
Hello, welcome. We'll make an excursion in the temple that was described by the prophet Ezekiel in the Bible. Until recently, there was no precise plan of Ezekiel's temple. Many architects add their own measurements while they make plans of Ezekiel's temple. All their plans do not contain few verses of the prophecy. It is very difficult to follow Ezekiel. My name is Natalia Bina. I was engaged in the problem of Ezekiel's temple for 30 years. Working on visualization of Ezekiel's prophecy, we kept one major principle: only the text, nothing more. If a wall was measured, there is the wall and the wall's dimensions. If Ezekiel described windows but the wall didn't measure it, there is no wall. Why we should think out instead of Ezekiel? We shouldn't think out sizes. The description of the temple is very precisely. If we speak about Ezekiel's temple, we should speak about the temple complex. It consists of several buildings. There are a wall, 6 complexes of gates, 4 houses of priests, 5 kitchens, 30 rooms refectories, and a temple, of course. I'm going to prove some physics. Firstly, Ezekiel's temple was never built, but moreover, it couldn't have built till the 20th century. Secondly, Ezekiel's temple cannot be built on the same place in Jerusalem. Further, the temple should be built in Judean desert, according to Bible's prophecy and according to all measurements. Lastly, we'll follow Ezekiel step by step and we'll see how the temple was measured. Could Ezekiel's temple have built in ancient time? Ezekiel was surprised while he saw that the top of the temple wider than a baton. It is a pyramid on the contrary. The floors are hanging above each other, but there are no pillars to prop up their bottom. Ancient builders did not build so in antiquity. They couldn't build so because they didn't have ferroconcrete beams or metal beams that able to sustain such huge cargo.
The side chambers surrounding the temple were wider at each successive story, because the structure surrounding the temple went upward by stages on all sides of the temple. Therefore, the width of the temple increased as it went higher, and thus one went up from the lowest story to the highest by way of the second story. The doorways of the side chambers toward the free space, and the width of the free space was 5 cubits all around.
While the gate was measured, there were measured pillars of the gate, a distance between the pillars. Ezekiel wrote about the windows and about the rooms of the gate, but he didn't write about walls of the gate, and walls were not measured. This means that there are no walls. We shouldn't think out. Let's follow the Bible. Today it is as easy to build, but such construction couldn't have built in ancient times. I hope I proved that the studies. Ezekiel's temple couldn't have built till the 20th century. I'll show that Ezekiel's temple cannot be built on the same place in Jerusalem. See you next time. Bye.
However, the older Jewish tradition maintained that only the Messiah could build this final temple. And this kind of goes back to the time the first temple was built. Although it was for the tribe of Levi to manage all the priests and all the sacrifices, the building and protection of that temple fell to the house of Judah, which was the royal house. Solomon built the temple for the Levites to operate in. And in the same way, the Messiah who comes from the house of Judah is expected in some way to build the temple for the new Levites to operate in. And so this old tradition maintained that only the Messiah could really build the final temple. Now, any rebuilding of that temple right now will only be temporary until the Messiah comes, and will probably therefore be a rebuild of the Jerusalem temple of Herod. The modern Jews, even the rabbinical ones, will probably not dare to start on the temple of Ezekiel, even if that were a literal temple, because they would leave that to the Messiah. Islam's great final battle with Israel is supposed to be in Jerusalem, with the Islamic victors sitting in the Jerusalem temple. Now, Paul does not speak of a new temple either. He just sort of refers to the temple as if it was the same one as in his own day. And so apparently that's what it is. Presumably then it's the same temple that will be rebuilt, a rebuild of the second temple. The lobby groups pushing for the third temple to be built have asked Putin and Trump already if they would consider funding the rebuild. And we'll just have a quick look at a video that talks about that, 15 minutes or so in length.
And greetings, friends. I just got this article from my inbox. Somebody sent this to my email, and it's from breakingisraelnews.com, and it's an article by Adam Berkowitz, dated November 10th, 2016, and the headline is, "The Sanhedrin asks Putin and Trump to build the third temple in Jerusalem." And that is a very significant event when it comes to Bible prophecy that I will get to after I read this article for you. It says here that the Sanhedrin is calling on Russian President Vladimir Putin and the U.S. President-elect Donald Trump to join forces to fulfill their biblically mandated roles by rebuilding the Jewish temple in Jerusalem. The Rabbi Weiss, the spokesman for the Sanhedrin, contacted Breaking Israel News to announce that the election of Trump, who has promised to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, coupled with Putin's expressed desire for the temple to be rebuilt, prompted the Jewish court to send a letter offering the two the opportunity to act as a modern-day Cyrus figures, non-Jewish kings who recognize the importance of Israel and the temple. You know, it's interesting. Lately, people are starting to call Donald Trump, they're saying that he's a type of a modern-day Cyrus because of his love for Israel, the Jewish people, and the Jewish faith. And many people are starting to call him the Anointed One. And as we've said in other broadcasts, Donald Trump is most likely the king of the north that's going to fulfill these prophecies that are coming up in Daniel the 11th chapter, verse 45, which has to do with Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. Now, it's interesting that many people are starting to call this election that just passed a miracle, that it was an historic election that was, of course, very, very important to the future of America. And they said that something like that will probably never happen again. That's the importance of this election. And that a miracle took place, a historic election. Even Barack Obama said this was an historic election, and no one was expecting Donald Trump to win. Now think of it. The world was against Trump. Half of America was against Trump. Pretty much half of America was against Trump. The media was against Trump. Trump's own party was against him. The Democrats were against him, obviously, yet the man still won. Now, as I said in the book of Daniel, God says he's the one that sets up kings and takes away kings when it comes to fulfilling his purpose. And more commentators, leaders, world leaders are saying that this election was an act of God, which it was, because God has, I believe, chosen Donald Trump to fulfill his purpose as the King of the North, which we have identified as the President of the United States, which you can see in other broadcasts. We prove to you that the King of the North is the President of the United States, and I believe Donald Trump is going to fulfill these prophecies in Daniel, the 11th chapter, verse 45, which has to do with Jerusalem. And more as time goes on towards his inauguration, more and more things are starting to shape up for him to fulfill this prophecy of Daniel, the 11th chapter, verse 45, which I'll go into after I go through this article, the rest of this article. It says here, the Rabbi Weiss explained that the U.S. elections have made the eternal Jewish dream a very real possibility. We are poised to rebuild the temple. The political conditions today in which two of the most important national leaders in the world support the Jewish right to Jerusalem as their spiritual inheritance is historically unprecedented. The Sanhedrin letter notes that Trump's upset victory was due to his support of Jerusalem and reminds Trump of his campaign promise to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, effectively recognizing the city as the capital of Israel. So once they do that, of moving that embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it recognizes Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now, think of it. How are the Iranians going to feel about that? And the Palestinians, how are they going to feel about that? It says here, the Jerusalem Embassy Act, passed in Congress in 1995, initiated the moving of the embassy, but has been vetoed since every American president since. It has been vetoed by every American president since. My apologies. The Sanhedrin calls on Trump to withhold the veto after he takes office. And then it talks about Putin and how he desires for the temple to be rebuilt. And then it says, but now that in the incoming U.S. president is a potential ally in the project, the Sanhedrin believes it is time for Putin to take an active role in rebuilding the temple. Rabbi Weiss emphasized that supporting the Jewish claim to Jerusalem would bring benefit Russia and America, as well as the entire world. The leaders of Russia and America can lead the nations of the world to global peace through building the temple, the source of peace, Rabbi Weiss explained. This will offset the disgraceful UNESCO resolutions that are the root cause of increasing terror and violence. All right, so they want Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, to be behind this temple building, of letting the Jews rebuild the temple, and not David C. Pack, who thinks he's going to rebuild the temple. And we go through that in the video that we show you that that David C. Pack thinks he's going to rebuild the temple for some reason. But the Bible plainly says that the Jews are going to do it, and that the King of the North is going to protect Israel during that time. Notice what it says here. It says he, that's the King of the North, the President of the United States, who is the head of the great Northern Alliance called NATO, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace. And we show you in our booklet, Middle Eastern Prophecy, that means military bases, military occupation between the seas, that's the Negev desert, and in the glorious holy mountain. That is Jerusalem, but specifically the glorious holy mountain where the temple stood. Now, why is it zeroing in on the glorious holy mountain? Well, because the temple, it is prophesied that the temple is going to stand in the end time. And how are the Palestinians going to feel about that? And what about the people of Iran, the Iranian government? How are they going to feel about the temple standing once again? Now, the Palestinians said that they are going to cause all sorts of problems for Donald Trump when he comes in to power. And what we see here is a protection of Israel, because the context is, verse 44, tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. And because of these tidings out of the east and out of the north, which is Iran, it says he will plant military bases in the Negev desert and in the glorious holy mountain. So there's troublous times coming. And he is going to protect Israel, and especially that Temple Mount, because either the Jews are building the temple or the temple is already there, and the Iranians and the Palestinians and everybody else that are against the temple building are troubling Israel, troubling the Americans, and so they are there to protect the Jews. Now, Jesus Christ of Nazareth talked about this temple as well in Matthew, the 24th chapter. Matthew 24, Jesus Christ says this. Go through it right quickly. Verse 15, it says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever readeth, let him understand." So there's going to be something abominable standing in the holy place. And the only holy place, when Jesus spoke of the holy place, they knew exactly what he was talking about. He was talking about the temple, spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And that's in Daniel the 12th chapter and verse 11. That says this, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice," so we see the sacrifices instituted once again, "shall be taken away, and the abomination that make desolate set up shall be 1,290 days." So the sacrifice is going to be taken away, and then an abomination is going to be set up in the temple of God. Now, what is that abomination? If we go to 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, and starting in verse 3, it says, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come," that's the day of the Lord, "except there come a falling away first, which I believe has already happened. And that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposes and exalts himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped." And we, in our booklet, The Beast of Prophecy, we identify this person as the false prophet that you read of in Revelation, the 13th chapter, verse 11, Revelation 19. We have identified him as the Pope in Rome. All that is called God, and that is worship, so that he, as God, and who calls himself the vicar of Christ, the one who represents Christ on earth, taking the place of Christ, well, the Pope in Rome, so that he, as God, sits in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. So there you have it. There is the abomination of desolation, a man standing in the temple as the vicar of Christ, saying that he is God and that he exalts himself above all that is called God, the Mother Church, and that the Mother Church is the head of all of Christianity, and that the Pope is the head of the Mother Church. So there is desolation, the abomination of desolation that stands in the holy place. And when that happens, Jesus Christ says, then there shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever indeed shall be. The great tribulation will start when that abomination is set up. And when you look at Ezekiel, the 9th chapter, talking about the destruction of Israel, God says here in verse 6, it says, "Slay utterly old and young, both maids and little children and women, but come not near any man upon whom there is the mark," and that is the Holy Spirit. And then it says, "Begin at my sanctuary. So it starts in the temple of God, and then in Ezekiel 5, it says that a fire should go out unto all the house of Israel. So it'll begin in Jerusalem, and then it'll spread unto all the house of Israel. And as it says in Daniel the 11th chapter, verse 45, it says, he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. The end of NATO, and then the beast will rise, and then comes the great tribulation. The beast is going to rise. The Pope's going to sit in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God, and then the great tribulation will begin. Then a little later on, it talks about verse 9 of Ezekiel 9, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah. Notice Israel and Judah. The house of Israel, being the United States, the British Commonwealth, the peoples of northwestern Europe, and Judah, the Jews, is exceeding great, and the land is full of blood, and the city full of perverseness, for they say, the Lord has forsaken the earth, and the Lord seeth not. There is no God. Many have become atheists. Many Jewish people are secular Jews. And we see secularism running rampant in Canada, in the United States. We have forsaken God. Then God says, as for me, also mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity, but I will recompense their way upon their head. And this is how God judges. He takes our ways and gives us exactly what we want. We want sin. Well, we're going to get sin, and you're going to get the effects of sin as well. And the wages of sin is death. And then in verse 11, which I believe means the work of God, the man clothed with linen, which had the inkhorn by his side, reported the matter, saying, I have done as you have commanded me to do. And that's what we are dedicated here at British Israel Media to do the work of God, so in the end we can stand before God and say, we have done what you have commanded us to do. So this breaking news story of the Jews wanting Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin to rebuild the temple is very, very significant indeed when you look at the biblical prophecies, especially the prophecy of the King of the North protecting Israel, and especially the glorious holy mountain where the temple is going to stand, because biblical prophecies say that the temple is going to stand once again in Jerusalem. For the BICOG Media, this is Peter Salemi.
Or will it instead be the Pope who builds the temple? There is a huge Vatican push at the moment to rebuild the Jerusalem temple, and the Vatican has already offered to fund it. They can build the Jerusalem temple now while America or Russia help them build the Ezekiel temple later on. There are many people actually clamoring to get this project underway.
I'll lay out a little history first, which will lead right into the key facts as to why the Vatican and the Pope are more in control than anyone else concerning the building of the coming Third Jerusalem Temple. One fact of recent history is the huge Bible prophecy of Israel suddenly becoming a nation in 1948. Most nations of the world immediately began recognizing Israel as a bona fide, brand new nation, but one nation of the world refused to recognize Israel, namely the Vatican State. And yes, the Vatican is recognized internationally as an actual country and is self-labeled as a monarchy, with its own king being the Pope himself. So that's a key fact of history, that since Israel's 1948 rebirth, the popes have refused to honor and recognize Israel as a bona fide nation. One key reason for this is that the popes of Rome had confiscated and or made legal claims to own much of the land in Israel during the centuries before Israel's rebirth in 1948. These legal claims of the Pope occurred during the Ottoman Empire's reign, right up to World War I, in the early 1900s. So virtually, once Israel was reborn in 1948, then the Vatican's immediate attitude towards Israel was, hey, wait just a minute. That holy land you're suddenly living on there, including the Temple Mount, happens to legally be ours. And this is the exact attitude of every pope from 1948 and to this day. So those are clear and hard facts which are documented in depth with headline news and links at heisnear.com in the section named Vatican Relations with Israel and in the section named Antichrist and Mideast Peace. Then in 1993, 45 years after Israel's rebirth, John Paul II authored the Fundamental Agreement, which is an actual contract he wrote to Israel for the express purpose of requiring Israel to give up the very land, including the Temple Mount, which the popes themselves still claim to this day to be the legal owners of. Now I could stop right here, having laid out these facts, and it's perfectly clear why the popes and Israel have had thorny negotiations since 1993 regarding who owns what in the Holy Land. Again, this is because the popes say we own that, and Israel also says legitimately that, well, but our people live here. Israel is our nation. Now to back up 8 years to 2005, then once Benedict XVI took office in April of 2005, then he was highly aggressive in taking the dormant Fundamental Agreement and immediately pushing it right into the face of Israel, even demanding the Vatican be given control of the Temple Mount, as headlines at heisnear.com show. In fact, Benedict was highly successful in bringing the Vatican-Israel negotiations of the Fundamental Agreement quickly around third base and right up to home plate, which is precisely where the negotiations are today. And that makes the next Vatican-Israel meeting, which is already scheduled in the next days of this month of December, a prime world event to keep our eyes on. Why? Because Daniel's major end-time prophecy has now clearly jumped into play tangibly. Daniel 9:27 foretells that he, Antichrist, will make a firm covenant with the many, being the end-time Jews of Israel, allowing Israel to build their third temple. So the fact that Antichrist, the Pope, has already made and virtually authored this contract in 1993's Fundamental Agreement, coupled with the fact that the Vatican-Israel negotiations are right now nearing finalization, then all of this shows that both parties of Daniel 9:27's prophecy, being Antichrist, the Pope, and the end-time Jews of Israel, are zooming this generation towards the execution of a 7-year agreement allowing Israel to build their third temple. And at that point coming is when this generation will have entered into the final 7-year tribulation period.
As far as the Vatican claims go, the history of their claim goes back quite some way. The Vatican claim comes right back from the times of the Crusades, and post-Crusade settlements assigned control but not ownership of Jerusalem to the Vatican. But the subsequent Ottoman occupation of Jerusalem broke that contract. When Lord Rothschild offered to alleviate the Ottoman Sultan's financial stresses by buying Jerusalem, it put the Vatican in an awkward position. So there's also a claim from the Rothschilds to the land in Jerusalem. With Rothschild's purchase, the Jewish state could be re-established, and Palestinian claims over Jerusalem were also voided.
The Foreign Office, November the 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet.
His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment of Palestine as a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur Balfour.
This is Dan Dix here reporting for Press for Truth. What you just heard was a reading of the Declaration of Balfour by Lord Jacob Rothschild in a very recent interview he just gave just a few months ago here in 2017, where he discussed his family's role in the formation of Israel as a nation. And in today's video, we're going to talk about how this agenda has been on the table not just for decades, but in fact for centuries. Now, I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here today when I say that the Rothschilds are an incredibly wealthy, powerful, and secretive family, and they are consumed by an all-out lust for power and control. Behind the scenes, they have been manipulating our finances and our politics, and with the ability to issue currency that is created out of thin air and then loaned to governments at interest, it is through this process that they manage to emerge on the very top of this pyramidal structure of power. But one thing I don't think very many people are aware of is the fact that this plan has been in the works for not just decades, but in fact centuries, and I am in possession of a document that can help substantiate that claim. What I'm holding right here in my hands is an original document. This was printed on November 28th, 1829. This is a Niles Weekly Register. And remember, this came out at a time when the press and the media was not as controlled as it is today. So researchers and journalists were able to put this kind of information out there. And the info contained herein suggests that the Rothschilds purchased Jerusalem and they had big plans in store for that landmass. So I'm just going to pick up the camera here and we'll read this to you. All right, guys, so this is the paper in question. This is a Niles Weekly Register. And bear in mind, this was printed in 1829. Unbelievable that they were able to put this kind of information out there back then, but as we said, they weren't as controlled as we are today. So, let's have a look at what they had to say here. I'm going to very carefully open this up because, as I said, this is an original document from 1829. And here is the article. I'll read it to you now. Jerusalem. There is a report that the Rothschilds have purchased Jerusalem. We see nothing improbable that in the pecuniary distress of the Sultan, he should sell some part of his dominions to preserve the rest, or that the Rothschilds should purchase the ancient capital of their nation. They are wealthy beyond desire, perhaps even avarice, and so situated it is quite reasonable to suppose that they may seek something else to gratify their ambitions that shall produce most important effects. If secured in the possession, and which may be brought about by money, they might instantly, as it were, gather a large nation together, soon to become capable of defending itself and having a wonderful influence over the commerce and the conditions of the East, rendering Judea again the place of a deposit of the large portion of the wealth of the ancient world. To the Sultan, the contrary is of no great value, but in the hands of the Jews, directed by such men as the Rothschilds, what might it not become? And in a short period of time. The Sultan is in great difficulty. Baron Rothschild was proceeding to Constantinople, and a second rebuilding of the temple is not among some of the most strange things expected in these strange times by some of the Jews. So there you have it, folks. The Rothschilds purchased Jerusalem, and as has been confirmed in this recent interview, they also formed the nation of Israel as we know it today. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments section below. It's pretty interesting stuff, especially when you consider that the reformation of Israel as a nation was foretold in the Bible. This was written about even as much as 3,500 years ago. So are the Rothschilds just playing on that, or what do you think is going on here? Now, as always, my friends, share this video if you found the information useful. And this channel is only made possible by you, the viewers. So thank you so much to anyone who has ever donated or contributed by becoming either a PFT member or a PFT patron. And stay tuned, folks. We're going to have more video reports coming soon. This is Dan Dix reporting for Press for Truth.
So 120 years before Israel became a nation, the Rothschilds apparently had already bought Jerusalem, maybe not all of Israel, but Jerusalem, and they were already preparing, laying the groundwork for the reformation of a nation in that territory, which took the path, of course, of the Balfour Declaration, and had to wait for 2 world wars, but in some ways also for the Holocaust before the Jews gained a sort of internationally agreed upon right to go back to that land and to live in Jerusalem. Now, that's why the Rothschilds could still be instrumental even in bringing about the second rebuilding of that second temple. Now, if we go back to our text, the texts from the book of Daniel, we'll find that there's a reference to 1260 days. It's 1290 in Daniel 12, but it's 1260 just about everywhere else you go. And so the two obviously related, but there is a 30-day difference. So it seems that 1260 days refers to the period for which Paul's man of sin persecutes the saints. And because of that slight difference, the first figure, 1260 days, is the persecution of saints, and the second, the 1290 days, refers to the temple desecration. If they both end at the same time, which they probably do, they probably both end with the second coming of Christ, then it means that the desecration of the temple precedes the great persecution of saints by 30 days. And there's a 30-day delay, therefore, between the setting up of that abomination in Jerusalem and the beginning of the grand global persecution of the saints. According to Paul, and by the way, 30 days is quite short in the political world. It's quite a fast work to move from one to the other and to institute this great plan. So according to Paul, the man of sin will seat himself in the holy place, pronouncing himself to be God and rejecting belief in any kind of deity. In fact, as a form of mockery of all deities, he pronounces himself to be God. Times of testing are, of course, part of salvation. Christ told those who followed him that they would suffer persecution in the world because of the nature of the world and because of the nature of the gospel itself, which sort of goes head to head with what is done in the world. It seeks to expose evil, and people, of course, don't want to be exposed. The work of Christ provides the grace for a man to find salvation, however, but the soft clay of the inner man eventually needs to be cured and to be tested in the fires of persecution. And this is where the indwelling of Christ produces true character and obedience in the soul of the Christian. 2 Thessalonians 2, 1-4. He says, concerning the coming of Christ and our being gathered to him, that day will not come until the rebellion, the Greek word is apostasia, occurs. And that man of lawlessness, the Greek word is anomia, nomia being law, anomia being without law, is revealed, the man who is doomed to destruction. He's rather like Judas. He was a man chosen for destruction because he had a purely evil work to do. He will exalt himself over everything that is called God or that is worshipped, setting himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. And Paul seemed to have a fairly developed idea of this, and presumably this came from pretty much from the scriptures or maybe one or two associated commentaries. The Apostle Paul seems to have a clear understanding of this period under the future man of sin and of how we should divide the scripture as relates to his appearance. The abomination will desecrate the temple for 43 months, the extra 30 days. So again, back at Daniel 12:11, from the time that the daily sacrifice is abolished and the abomination that causes desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. This desecrating object seems directly linked to the image of the beast that all are forced to worship in Revelation 13:8. And yet the man of sin seats himself in the temple. So it's not like there's a statue there in the holy place, but now the man of sin himself is in the holy place. At one level, it seems that the image of the beast is the image of man, or the man of sin himself. Will the image of the beast simply be an image of man or of a king, as it was for King Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 3? Remember, Nebuchadnezzar erected a huge statue of basically himself there, which was 60 cubits tall, or about 90 feet tall, which everybody had to worship? Or will it be an image of Lucifer, falsely acclaimed to be the father of mankind in the transition to the Luciferian society? Although it says he won't worship any god, Lucifer may be an emblem of the rejection of all gods, because Lucifer was a god in a way that set men free from bondage to any of the gods. Now, Lucifer is also worshipped as a kind of king in the secret societies because of his refusal to yield to Jehovah and for providing liberating technology to mankind. Or could it be a speaking image of Lucifer that all are called to worship in Revelation 13:15? And notice I have a lot of sort of smart devices in the background there. I have no doubt that there'll be the use of very advanced technology, very coordinated technology in this last phase of Earth history. Because technology was even used in the time of Jesus in Greek temples to fake the voice of gods and to make doors open as if by an invisible hand. All these kinds of things were done by Greek technicians working in the temples. And today we have plenty of advanced technology that can create all kinds of illusions that could go with the image of the beast, or could in fact be the image of the beast. All kinds of media and technical devices. So perhaps this dictate to worship man alone would be beamed into TVs all around the world. Maybe this is the image of the beast. People may be watched, as in Roman times, to ensure they worship the image. We have smart TVs that can watch us. The TVs themselves may give us commands to maybe worship or something like worship this government and this regime, and those people who refuse may well be being watched through the TVs and noted for their non-compliance, just as people in times of Jesus, if they didn't bow down to the Caesar statue, were reported and then taken away and interrogated. Those refusing to worship would be reported, arrested, and possibly even executed. And we know that this happened in certain Roman cities. Paul says the man of sin will place himself on a throne in the temple. Now, the seat is another way of saying throne, because in the old days a ruler would sit on a kind of seat. Even the judgment seat of Jesus, which is a throne, is called a seat in the Greek. So this man of sin sits on a seat in the temple, which we assume is a throne, and that throne was usually where the Ark of the Covenant was placed, in the Holy of Holies. So rather than acknowledge any deity to be God, the man of sin refers to himself as God. I don't think he probably believes he is God, but it's probably a form of mockery. He will bring together the spirit of man and its arrogance and the image of Lucifer and what it represents. In casting off Jehovah and the old religions, he can do more. He can mock those religions by instead choosing to worship Lucifer. It may only be a media stunt, but it could well happen. Perhaps mockingly, he invokes Lucifer as the true Messiah and Son of God. What we do know is that whatever he does, it will be the ultimate abomination. So with that last comment, I conclude tonight's talk, and maybe it was a bit shorter than some expected, and maybe it was a welcome break, but we'll pick it up in part 2 next week. If people want to ask some questions at the end of this time, then please do. There's some time available for that. Next week we will have nearly a 2-hour session. It will be on paper at least about 100 minutes. And so rather than start on that this week, we'll pick it up next week. So thanks for listening again tonight. And if you're going now, I just hope you'll have a great week. And if you're staying on a bit, it'll be good to talk to you. Thanks very much. Good night. Bye.